Hello, my lovelies. Welcome back to the Geek Suite. I'm your host and DM for the evening, the one and only Kidner Bean, and today we're continuing our D&D 5e series, Dungeons & Dragons and Ice and Fire. In this series, we compare Game of Thrones characters to their book counterparts using the Dungeons & Dragons 5e character sheets. And for all our new viewers, be sure to hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell so you can stay up to date on all our latest content. And as always, my lovelies, I'm going to start this episode with a all-encompassing spoiler warning for both the books and the show. That includes seasons 1 through 8, any DVD bonus content, and all of the books, including but not limited to the pre-release chapters of The Winds of Winter and the extended works such as Fire and Blood and The World of Ice and Fire. So, be aware, you have been warned. Alrighty, my lovelies, we're continuing on with our part 2 for our Twitter and Patreon poll winner, Jon Snow, the King in the North, the White Wolf. If you want to take part in our polls, be sure to follow me on Twitter at KidnerBean. And if you want your votes to count double, be sure to sign up for my Patreon. I'll go ahead and leave a link in the description section down below. So for part 2 of our Jon Snow breakdown, we are going to be covering the HBO rendition since we covered Book Jon in episode 1. So, in the show, Jon is human. Easy peasy. Dead, undead, whatever, he's human.
They think you're some kind of god. The man who returned from the dead.
I'm not a god.
I know that. I saw your pecker. What kind of god would have a pecker that small?
For his class, we're going to classify him as a ranger. And looking at our D&D description of the ranger class, we see the following. Though a ranger might make a living as a hunter, a guide, or a tracker, a ranger's true calling is to defend the outskirts of civilization from the ravages of monsters and humanoid hordes that press in from the wild. In some places, rangers gather in secretive orders or join forces with druidic circles. Many rangers, though, are independent almost to a fault, knowing that when a dragon or a band of orcs attacks, a ranger might be the first, and possibly the last, line of defense. And I don't know about you guys, but that description pretty much sounds like the Night's Watch vows, so if Jon isn't a ranger, I don't know who is. Now, as we mentioned before, Jon's upbringing in Winterfell makes him a little bit different from the classic ranger who would gripe about being a coddled highborn, or city folk, or southern folk, as they like to make fun of in the north, since Jon was being raised in a castle. And we see that being raised in a castle, he has difficulty adjusting to life at the wall at first. And the other rangers consider him a coddled southern noble lad, jokingly calling him Lord Snow.
If that were a real sword, you'd be dead. Lord Snow here grew up in the castle, spitting down on the likes of you.
Which brings us to his background. Jon was raised as a highborn bastard, so the most appropriate background to give him would be that of the noble. Or, noble-ish. Noble adjacent. This makes, as I mentioned, his life as a ranger a bit difficult at first, but it eventually works out for him and allows his story to progress in the north. He eventually bonds with his brothers, and his Stark blood makes him valuable to both the wildlings and the Night's Watch. He's granted an audience with Mance Rayder and Stannis. Plus, when he's kidnapped by the wildlings, they value him for his Stark blood. He gets selected to shadow Lord Commander Mormont and is groomed for leadership, as this would be a natural progression for a noble character. And, before his mutiny at least, he's selected to be Lord Commander after Mormont's death. As far as alignment goes, Jon starts his story, like all the Starks, or in his case a Snow, as lawful good. And I would argue that he kind of becomes jaded over the course of the series, but I would still say that he remains lawful good. He's unable to kill the horse rancher for the Night's Watch when he's traveling with Ygritte and company south of the Wall, but he is able to kill Janos Slynt for treason, and hang Ollie and company for murdering him later on. He doesn't enjoy killing, but does it because the law demands it. He tries to do everything by the book and never deviates, even when it's really stupid. Like, not lying to Cersei about bending the knee to Daenerys when they're begging her for help to stop the White Walker threat. Now, looking at the information we've got so far, as a human ranger with a noble background who's lawful good, we're going to select the following skill proficiencies for him. Animal handling, as a warg, obviously. Athletics, history, persuasion, and survival. I mean, he came back from the dead, you guys. That's gotta be one of them for sure. Okay, and now that we've gotten the basics like race, class, alignment, and such out of the way, let's see how his character skills break down. Now, we're going to be sort of blending D&D metrics to see where these various skills and abilities level out for Jon Snow. As I've mentioned before, normally in D&D, for those who maybe don't play, or don't play as regularly, you roll to determine your abilities and strengths, and you build them as your character grows as you go on more campaigns and adventures. But for this, we're going to look at evidence from the show to see where these would pan out for Jon, based on how he's portrayed. But we are going to be using the same point scale that you would use for D&D. So normally for a D&D character setup, an average for any given ability is usually about a 10, with 14 to 16 being on the high end, and 18 and over being reserved for supernaturally powered beings. In the HBO Game of Thrones series, these would be people like the Night King, the Zombie Mountain, the Dragons, and Bran. And Arya, aka Wolverine, for being able to do stuff like, I don't know, kill the Night King. Jon is brought back from the dead, but it doesn't appear to give him any powers, so I don't think it's cause for a supernaturally powered score. Alright, well now that we've reviewed how these abilities are being utilized and measured for our D&D character sheet, let's go ahead and see how Jon does. Alright, for his strength, we're going to put that in at a 14. We see that he's pretty strong, and in the show, he's able to do things like climb the wall. And he holds his own in battle. So we're going to put him, not at maxed out, but at a 14. Higher than average. Alright, so moving on to the next category on our sheet, we have dexterity. As a ranger class, this is going to be pretty high for him. He is known, at least in the show they call him this, as one of the best swordsmen in Westeros. And he is very agile in the training pits and fights. One of my favorite scenes is when he's fighting the White Walkers and does this great move where he just completely shatters him with his Valyrian steel sword. So we're going to put him in at a 16 for dexterity. Pretty high, but not supernaturally so. Alright, moving on to Constitution. He's going to be pretty maxed out here, for a few reasons. Being brought back from the dead isn't one of them, oddly enough, though. But there are a handful of events that get swept under the rug that give away that he's nearly indestructible, except for apparently a series of tiny knives. Alright, so initially in Season 1, when he grabs the lamp to burn the whites, in the books he has a long-lasting wound and has to relearn how to use his sword hand. But in the show, he's only mildly burned for a bit. Later on, Ygritte puts 3 arrows in him, and in the books he arrives on death's door to Castle Black, and is in recovery for like a month before he's up and walking and able to attend his, trial for treason. In the show, he's down for like 20 minutes and it's resolved within a single episode. Most importantly, during the Battle of Castle Black, he gets his head smashed into an anvil by the Magnar of Then and just f***ing rolls with it like no big deal, like he's goddamn Wile E. Coyote. And also, people like to reference him tucking and rolling through the fire immediately after this as, like, evidence that he's a secret Targaryen, but I don't know about that. His hand was burned back in Season 1, both in books and show. But, yeah, more importantly, he's able to take an anvil to the face without so much as a broken nose. So we're going to put him in at an 18 for Constitution. Alright, moving on to Intelligence and Wisdom. Jon sort of falls into that dumb jock stereotype territory again here. He isn't stupid, but he does have that, dumb frat boy mentality for someone his age we would expect. Ygritte repeatedly comments on his ignorance about things with her refrain of, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." And people have to repeatedly explain stuff to him that should be obvious. Like, Tyrion has to point out that he's had a pretty good life compared to his new companions at the Night's Watch. So complaining about it is kind of a crummy thing to do. Or when Sam has to point out that he's being made Mormont's steward because he's being groomed for leadership, not as a punishment because he's a bastard. So he gets an 8 for intelligence. He's also gonna get an 8 for wisdom because Jon is kind of dumb in the show. Like, he doesn't have any of the inner monologue that he does in the books, where he acknowledges that his actions may come back to bite him. He blindly continues to follow Daenerys with no reason why, just his annoying refrain of the meme, "She's my queen," no matter what her actions are. He appears to have learned nothing from his past mistakes, unlike his book counterpart, because, again, it falls to people like Tyrion and Sam and Arya to explain why continuing to blindly follow Dany is dangerous and stupid. So yeah, he gets an 8 for wisdom. Alright, so now we're down to our last section, charisma. As a ranger, an outsider of society, it's not going to be high. Now, it is going to be higher in the show than the books, because after he starts winning battles, people cheer him on and begin to choose him as their leader because of his military skill. But outside of a post-battle high, people don't actually care for him all that much. They question his judgment, his loyalty when he's in love with Ygritte and or Dany, and his personality is pretty bland. He just kind of mopes about. So much so that in the final season, they even have Tyrion make jokes about it.
I came down here to brood over my failure to predict the Greyjoy attack. You're making it difficult. You look a lot better brooding than I do. You make me feel like I'm failing at brooding over failing.
I'm a prisoner on this island.
I wouldn't say you're a prisoner on this island. Feel free to walk the car.
So I'm going to weigh those against each other and just leave them at an average 10. And speaking of charisma, I certainly hope you don't mind all that much that I'm going to shamelessly promote my Patreon here. My patrons are who make this channel possible. Our patrons get access to exclusive Patreon-only content, early access to our videos, access to the Geek Suite Discord, and they get to participate in polls for video topics, like the one that selected the topic for this video. And in those polls, Patreon votes count twice. Details are available on our Patreon page. Like I mentioned before, the link is in the description section down below. Now, looking at things like armor class and initiative, for other characters, we've just kind of skinned over them, but these may be more important for a character like Jon. Jon varies between light and medium armor depending on what point in the story he's at. At the Wall, he has access to a poorly supplied armory, but as a wildling, he's only got thick padding and furs to protect him. Whereas, when he's king in the north, he has a full set of proper armor. So his armor class, which is 11 or 12 plus the dexterity modifier, is between 14 and 16, which would make his speed somewhere between 20 and 30 feet, but since he's crossing entire continents in a matter of minutes, we're going to go ahead and give him that jetpack boost of infinity speed, and his initiative is a basic 0. Now, looking at features and traits, these are going to be the same as they were for episode 1, but let's go ahead and skim over them for our noble ranger. As a noble, he gets the feature Position of Privilege, which states that thanks to your noble birth, people are inclined to think the best of you. You're welcome in high society, and people assume you have the right to be wherever you are. The common folk make every effort to accommodate you and avoid your displeasure. And other people of high birth treat you as a member of the same social sphere. You can secure an audience with a local noble if you need to. And as I mentioned before in our part 1, Jon has bits and pieces of this as a highborn bastard. He is able to secure audiences with people like Mance Rayder and Stannis and Daenerys and Cersei, but they don't always give him this assuming he has the right to be wherever he is, being welcomed in high society, or the common folk making every effort to accommodate him. We see this a lot when he's trying to gather forces to retake Winterfell. A lot of people would rather stay with Ramsay either out of fear or loyalty than they would with a bastard or a woman like Sansa. Moving on to his featured and traits for the Ranger class, we have the Favored Enemy, which states that beginning at first level, and you get to choose more as you level up, you get to choose one type of Favored Enemy. Having a Favored Enemy means you have advantage on Wisdom and Survival checks to track your favorite enemies, as well as on intelligence checks to recall information about them. You also get the ability to speak that language of your favorite enemy, if one is spoken at all. The next feature is going to be Natural Explorer. So this one, they get to be particularly familiar with one type of natural environment and are adept at traveling and surviving in such regions. Basically, you choose one type of terrain, and when you make an intelligence or wisdom check related to your favorite terrain, your proficiency bonus is doubled if you're using a skill that you're proficient in. There's also a slew of following benefits like not having slowed travel, group can't become lost except by magical means, getting double the food when foraging as you normally would, and so on and so forth. Rangers also have the ability to select a particular style of fighting as their specialty. They have the ability of land stride, which means that moving through non-magical difficult terrain costs you no extra movement. And at the 10th level, they have the ability to hide in plain sight, in which they spend 1 minute creating camouflage so long as they have access to fresh mud, dirt, plants, soot, etc. And once they're camouflaged this way, they can hide by pressing themselves up against a solid surface, such as a tree or a wall. It has to be at least as tall and as wide as they are, and you gain a +10 bonus to dexterity or stealth checks, as long as they remain there without moving or taking an action. At the 14th level, they have the ability to vanish. Now, I don't see Jon use either of these abilities, but they may be in his repertoire later on, when he goes north of the wall after his banishment. And like I said, we are just skimming over these abilities here in the part 2 because I went over them in detail in part 1, and Jon has quite a few as a noble ranger. If you want to hear the detailed descriptions of each of these features and abilities, I'll go ahead and leave a link to part 1 somewhere around here and in the description section down below. Alrighty, moving on to the last bits. For his ideals, we're going to keep this simple. Honor and validation. He's got kind of a Zuko vibe where he wants to restore his honor that his father took from him in making him a bastard. And he wants to be treated like the legitimate Stark children. For bonds, these are going to be people that he has relationships with in the show that have meaningful connections to him and affect his decisions. So for the show, this is going to be Robb Stark, Ghost, Dany, and Ygritte. And his biggest flaw is going to be it's going to be his bland status. I mean, it was going to be his bastard status like it was in the books, but just, I mean, man, really, that refrain of, "She's my queen," for season 7 and 8, it just, I can't, you guys. It just really prevented him from making any meaningful input into the finale of the story. I mean, really, with the way his and Dany's stories end, being the Song of Ice and Fire, they could have done so much more with that, but they just decided for, "She's my queen," and that horrible ending of tricking her into a false sense of security just so she could be killed, and then him to basically get sent back to his old job. I don't even want to talk about the end of the series, you guys. If you want to hear me talk about the end of the series, leave a comment in the comment section down below, and I'll go ahead and do a video on that. Well, here you have it. Here's what the HBO iteration of Jon Snow looks like spelled out on paper. And here's how they look compared side by side to George R.R. Martin's iteration. Thanks so much for sticking around to see how the King in the North turned out. Be sure to hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell, you guys. Ring it. And of course, be sure to sign up for Patreon to help vote on who we'll cover next. That's all the time I've got for today, my lovelies. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Mwah!